Welcome to our weekly 3-minute therapy podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, clinical psychologist with the website 3minutetherapy.com. And I'm here with Chris Rossini, the tech engineer for these podcasts. And 3-minute therapy is based on REBT, rational emotive behavior therapy, which was devised by Albert Ellis in the 1980s and caused the sea change in the psychotherapy movement from this more psychoanalytically oriented therapy, which was based on Sigmund Freud's ideas. One of the main ones is that our emotions and emotional problems particularly come from our childhood, whereas Albert Ellis very astutely showed that our emotional problems don't come from our childhood because our emotions come from our thinking about situations, not from situations themselves, like what happened in our childhood. So that's the premise that we work with. It's our emotions come from our thinking about situations, not situations themselves. And today we're going to be discussing free-floating anxiety. This is a term used by some psychologists when their clients are anxious, but they don't really know what they're anxious about. So they just fluff it off to, well, it's just free-floating anxiety. But as we know, there's no such thing as any emotion that's free-floating, that's unanchored in some thinking. So if you're anxious, you normally have some type of thinking, and in particular, it's thinking in terms of demands, must, shoulds, supposed tos, and have tos. And all our emotional and behavioral disturbances come from this type of thinking. And there are three main areas of this thinking. One is a demand on oneself, which causes anxiety, guilt, or depression. And that takes the form of, because I prefer to do well and get approval, I absolutely must, I have to. And if I fail, that's awful, I'm no good, and I can't stand it. The second demand, or must, humans have, causes anger, resentment, and hostility. And that comes from, starts with a preference. I strongly prefer you treat me fairly, considerately, and kindly, and therefore you absolutely must. You have to treat me well, and if you don't, you're no good. And that causes those kinds of emotions: resentment, hostility, and anger, and homicide, wars. And the third demand is a demand not on oneself or others. It's a demand on the impersonal conditions of one's life. And that comes from, starts with a preference. I prefer my life go fair, easily, hassle-free. And if it doesn't, and it absolutely must, it must be fair, easy, and hassle-free. And if it's not, then my life is awful, terrible, and horrible. So I'll just put off any of these horrible goals I have till tomorrow, or kill myself, or escape with addictions and feel good right now to avoid the discomfort through alcohol and drugs. So those are the three main musts. So if you have emotional behavioral disturbance, track it down to one of those three main musts, and then question, challenge, and contradict them. Ask yourself, what's the evidence that things must go well? What's the evidence others have to treat you well? What's the evidence you must do well and get approval? And there's no evidence, there never is any evidence, why things must be the way you wanted them to be. The only way that could be is if you ran the universe and you controlled everyone and everything, then things would have to be the way you want it to be, and people would have to treat you the way you wanted them to treat you. And you would have to always do well and get approval. But because you're an imperfect human who acts imperfectly, there's no reason why you always have to do well and get approval. Today, we're going to be discussing free floating anxiety. And now you can see from what I just outlined, there is no such thing as anxiety that just floats around freely, but rather anxiety comes from your thinking. So it's anchored in some kind of thinking. And that's normally the first demand, the first must. I must do well and get approval. And if I don't, it's awful. And that awfulizing causes your anxiety. So to work on that, the first step is to identify the must. What's your demand? What's causing your anxiety? Such as I must do well and get approval. Question it, challenge it, and contradict it. Ask yourself, what's the evidence I must? And the answer is there is no evidence that I have to do well and get approval. I strongly prefer to do well and get approval, but it's not an absolute. If I fail to do well and get approval, that's uncomfortable, unfortunate, but not the end of my world. I've survived discomfort before, and I've survived disapproval in the past, and I will survive it in the future. It's not the unfortunate situation that's causing my anxiety, but rather it's my demand about that. And with practice, I can change my thinking, give up my demand, and reinforce my preference. So by thinking that through, writing out that process that I just outlined again and again and again with much practice, you can uproot your musts, your demands, your anxiety, and live at worst with great discomfort and disappointment, frustration, but not anxiety. So that's the process to go through, and practice that. If you have any questions about that, please comment below. If you would like to be a guest on the program, we've had guests before, so please let me know. And my website has my email address, my phone number if you'd like to reach me. My website is 3minutetherapy.com. 3 is the word spelled out. If you enjoyed this or found this useful in any way, please give it a thumbs up and suggest subjects for the future, and volunteer if you'd like to be on. And thank you, Chris Rossini, our tech engineer, for making this happen. And subscribe to the 3 Minute Therapy podcast to stay on the rational side of life.